Now let's explore Nina Young's piece, Heart.throb. And we're going to use Nina's piece as an example of how to learn something from studying to interpretation, with the goal of going from big to small, from framing to style to the text, and from being inspired by a piece of music, from falling in love with a piece of music, and we tend to fall in love with little moments, to figuring out how we're going to execute those moments and tie them together. Because I would love to show you a way of playing this piece that's yours as an interpreter, not just mine, and where you have some freedom of interpretation. This piece is fairly complicated in terms of implements, playing techniques, and electronics, and navigating those as a performer is easier when we enter the practice room or go on stage with a really clear idea of what we want that piece to sound like. And that idea can be informed or sort of aided by studying the works of the composer, getting a sense of style. And so when we enter the practice room, we have a strong hypothesis of what we want the music to sound like. Before we dig into the details of Heart.throb, we can take another side quest because working with Nina on this piece highlighted some of my deepest principles about goals when commissioning music, especially commissioning music as a percussionist. When I'm collaborating with a composer on a new work or commissioning a piece, I have kind of three secret goals in terms of what I'd like that work to be like. As a percussionist, I'm interested in a piece of music that's interpretable, meaning that two different performers might have a different take, or where the interpretation of a performer is a meaningful value add to a piece of music instead of sort of depleting it in some way. At the same time, I'm interested in music that's idiomatic. I don't mean music that's easy to play, but music that takes into account the characteristics of an instrument or a speaker array or space in which the work is to be, the work is to take shape, meaning that it could only occur on this instrument, and it takes into account positively and negatively the unique characteristics of that instrument. Finally, I'm interested in new pieces for percussion that are subversive, meaning they cause us to rethink something we thought we knew or thought we understood, and that they surprise us in meaningful ways. And Heart.throb is a great example of a piece that does all these three and more. I wanted to work with Nina on this Unsnared drum project because I love her music, and I thought that she would bring something dramatic and interesting and unusual to the snare drum, and I hope you agree that she did. Nina's music has kind of a phenomenal blend of sonic inventiveness, formal rigor, and kind of immediate expressivity. I love that she brings the sort of technological and scientific principles of spectralism to even acoustic music. I love that her music draws inspiration from a number of practices, that it sort of engages with the past and the present and the future. And that I love that it has sort of a blend of the kind of European experimental sensibility and kind of an American aesthetic. I would describe her style as colorful, as intuitive, as witty on the one hand, and at the same time kind of formalized, meaning that she's concerned with long scale form. It's adventurous music, and at the same time it's synthetic. By that I mean that she creates a world where electronics and live sounds are fused together. I think 4 of Nina's pieces stylistically have an influence on this piece, Heart.throb. 1, the piece Sun Propeller for violin and electronics. I love in this piece the way the electronics and the live performer's sound are fused in a really intuitive way. And that's kind of a goal for us when we play this piece, Heart.throb. I loved her piece Memento Mori for string quartet. What I like about this piece is how it engages with something from the past and brings it to the present in sort of a profound way. And to be honest, Heart.throb sort of does that, taking on and challenging percussion traditions and sort of turning them on their head. I think her piece Remains for two pianos and 2 percussion also has an influence here, meaning that it sort of balances technical specificity, but with also sort of an intuitive phrasing. It's a piece of music that sort of expects that a performer is going to do something musical with the musical material. And then finally, I think the piece Tête-à-Tête for 2 toy pianos and decibels and electronics has some influence on this piece in that it sort of combines wit and fun, those kind of eyebrow-raising moments, with an immense craft. So as we're going through this piece, Heart.throb, I encourage you to check out those works because, oh, and all of Nina's music, of course, because I think they have a strong influence on the style and the content of this piece, Heart.throb. What I love about this piece, Heart.throb, is that it's basically in a complete inversion of percussive skill. Everything that we typically do to show virtuosity as a percussionist doesn't work in this piece. In fact, your main job as a performer in this piece is to be a filter. The drum is the star. The drum, the sounds coming out of the drum through the electronics are filtered and managed by the performer. Nina writes in the program note that the drum reveals the drummer, and that's totally true. Likewise, what I love about this piece is that it has a really detailed and nuanced approach to color. These are not traditional snare drum techniques. And when there are traditional snare drum techniques, they typically occur veiled on the rim of the drum. I was very fortunate to have the chance to collaborate with Nina in the development of this piece, Heart.throb. We started by sharing ideas and music that we liked, kind of creating mixtapes together. We spent some time improvising together on an incredible instrument called Marvin, Mega Marvin, that she owns from this incredible company, Morph Beats. We spent some time together at Avaloq Farm Music Institute, experimenting with techniques and spending some time apart to explore some ideas of notation. So as a result, I hope Nina would agree that the piece represents, of course, Nina's profound musical ideas, but both of our creative voices. On the one hand, in terms of the sort of techniques that she thought that I was good at doing, and on the other hand, sort of it's representative of a musical friendship. As you're learning Nina Young's Heart.throb, or for that matter, as you're learning any piece of music, it's a really helpful and fun exercise to ask yourself, well, what makes a great interpretation of this piece? Because thinking about what constitutes a really good performance of something forces you to think about the piece in a really nuanced and detailed way. So what makes a great performance of Heart.throb? I think a great performance of this piece is colorful, it's intuitive, it's witty, and it's adventurous on the one hand, but it's also accurate, specific, and transparent. What do I mean by that? I mean that we have parametric specificity with dynamics, articulation, color. The piece is really specific with regard to rhythm as well. So even though we have to engage with the electronics, the printed score includes a lot of information. So a great performance does that information. At the same time, a great performance of Heart.throb is opinionated. It's willing to go further than Nina writes to be able to show that nuance to an audience, to be able to drive the point home, and to really be able to engage with people about the details of the piece. At the same time, I think a great performance of this piece is melodic, that it engages with the remarkable harmonic content in the work and kind of enlivens the rhythms of the piece with that kind of melodic sensibility. Finally, a great performance of this piece, to me, meaningfully blends the electronics in sort of a seamless and logistically facile way, that it fuses the live performer and the electronics in a way that's breathtaking, spellbinding, and to some extent, invisible. The most obvious defining feature of this piece, Heart.throb, is the use of live electronics. Although there are no speakers, the drum is the speaker. We have to develop the skill as a performer of engaging with the electronics in a meaningful way, determining the mode of engagement. Are we sort of balancing with the electronics? Are we subverting them? Are we superseding them? And in a piece like this, the electronic parts are not written out. Nina does not write a sort of staff with the electronic parts. So it's our job as a performer to get to know them as if we were getting to know a new duo partner. We have to develop the ability to engage with the electronics as a new skill. So I recommend, before we start practicing, to listen to the electronics cue by cue. Where are they loud? Where are they soft? Where are they aggressive? Where are they dense? Where are they sparse? That way, when we practice, we have a clear sense of what we want to produce in each section, and more specifically, we have a sense of how we want to engage with the electronics. In fact, sitting with the sound of the piece is so important that I used to play the piece with a track that Nina made of just the electronic sounds vibrating, and I would play that track on stage before I would go on stage. Getting to know the electronics also has a huge impact on how we play the piece. Most importantly, it has an impact on how specific we are when we play. In this piece, Heart.throb, the performer is most often acting as a filter. And so as a great filter, we need to have a really nuanced approach to parameters. That might mean the density of our roll, our placement on the drum head, our placement on the rim of the drum, the pressure that we need to play with. Our goal as a performer is to not just be on or off, but to have a really wide range of things that we can do in order to engage meaningfully with the electronics. Finally, I'll say that it's our job as a performer to go beyond this, to sort of highlight the timbral changes in the work and to sort of exaggerate them to fit an acoustical or cultural space in which we're performing the piece. Now let's talk about what we need in order to play Heart.throb. So for a drum, I use a Pearl Masters custom 5x14-inch maple drum. I chose this drum because it's wood, and in working on the piece, I found that a wood drum was less likely to feed back with the electronics than a metal drum. I chose this drum because it has wire snares instead of cable snares, and the piece is going to get pretty buzzy, so having wire snares is really helpful. I also chose this drum because it has die-cast hoops, and the die-cast hoops sound pretty good when we're hitting the rim of the drum, which happens a lot in the piece. At the same time, the hoops are stiff, so they can sustain kind of a floppy, flappy, flabby, detuned head. At the same time, the drum is, sorry Pearl, not the most expensive drum I own, so I didn't mind attaching a transducer to the bottom head. In terms of a head, I use a Remo-coated Diplomat head. You need a coating on the head for the brush stuff later. And because the head's thin, it's a little bit easier to press into throughout the piece than a thicker head. For sticks, I use a pair of Swizzle sticks. So Nina marks for hard felt sticks. These are Firth SD6 Swizzle sticks. I use these partly out of nostalgia because when I was working with Nina, I sent her a bag of sticks, and the Swizzle sticks were in there partly as an economical thing. There's both sticks and mallets. And she wrote the piece using them, so I like to play the piece using them. But I also like that the felt, in general, sounds pretty good on the snare drum, and I don't feel bad about playing the rim with the Swizzle sticks. At the same time, you're gonna need a brush. Again, I use this Firth, well-loved Firth wire brush. I like that, again, that it has stiff bristles because we're going to be pressing into the head throughout the piece with the brush. So something that's really floppy is less of a good choice here. Finally, I use a different pair of drumsticks in the piece. Nina doesn't say to, but as after cue number 21, after the chorale, I switched to these Firth Modern Jazz #2 drumsticks. I use these because the bead is really long, and throughout the piece, we're going to be playing on the rim a lot. So having a long bead is really, really helpful. I also chose them because they're light, and I found that light drumsticks produced a lot of interesting colors on the rim of the drum versus kind of a heavier, duller stick. Also, the taper is very long, so I liked that it was a little bit easier for me to get some of the rim shots. Finally, you're going to need a dreadlock, one of these Firth dreadlocks. I have not found a good substitute for this because we're going to need to be kind of scraping the rim of the drum with them. So in addition to the percussion objets in Heart.throb, we have a number of technological thingy-dings as well. So we're going to need a contact mic to play the piece. You actually don't need a contact microphone. I've seen people have great success with just a small diaphragm condenser. I use a contact microphone attached to the drum. This is a Zeppelin Audio Cortado microphone. I like it because it has an XLR output and it manages the impedance really well. But you can experiment with any kind of microphone that works. You can also experiment with the position of the microphone on the drum to find something that minimizes feedback. We're going to need a transducer attached to the bottom head. The one that Nina recommends in the score is this one. It's a Dayton Audio transducer. It's going to be glued to the resonant head of your drum. So just make sure that you choose a drum that you don't mind sacrificing a resonant head on. You will need an amplifier for the transducer. This is also the one that Nina recommends in the score, Dayton Audio, and it will route into your interface. For an audio interface, technically you only need one input and two outputs. But for a piece like Heart.throb, I recommend an audio interface that has 4 outputs, because if you're playing this piece, there's a strong likelihood you'll be playing other pieces with electronics on the concert. So it's nice to have the outputs of this piece be kind of separate. You're going to need a pedal to advance between the electronic cues in the piece. Any USB pedal will work, because within the patch you can select any pedal that's attached to your computer. Finally, you're going to need Max MSP, the software program. Nina gives pretty detailed instructions in the patch of how to set up everything, and we will talk about that separately. But just as a note, you need to download this separate CNMAT external sinusoids in order to play the piece. Let's do a little bit of a walkthrough of how to sort of connect everything we need electronically and technologically to get our practice going for Heart.throb. So for the audio routing, we're going to need to take the contact microphone and route it into our audio interface. If you have multiple inputs, it really doesn't matter which one, because within Max MSP, you can select which input you want the audio to be coming from. At the same time, we're going to need the transducer attached to the transducer amplifier, and the output of the transducer amplifier is going to go into the output of our interface through these 2 TRS cables. So whether you use outputs 1 and 2 or 3 and 4 doesn't really matter. Finally, the transducer amplifier, we're going to turn this up to about 90%. I like to keep this as a constant when I play the piece, because it's one less thing to have to worry about. In general, if you have control over the gain of your microphones and everything, I recommend turning all that to 0 and operating everything level-wise from within the Max patch. Finally, we're going to need to be able to connect our USB pedal to the Max patch. So within the patch, you can click this button to find whatever attached devices you have, and then you can sort of select it from this list. I connect my pedal with one of these little USB hubs, but if you have a native USB pedal, it doesn't really matter what it goes into. We should be almost set up now, but within the Max patch, we're going to need to, as Nina said, install these CNMAT externals from the package manager. So in order to do that, you can open the package manager in Heart.throb and search for CNMAT externals. The piece will not work without them, because you need to use the sinusoids that are in those externals in order to get going with the piece. So within the Max patch, we have a variety of things that we can control. We can control the microphone level. We can control the level of snare reinforcement. I mean, this is the amplification of the snare. And then we can control the total output level. In addition, we have some controls here to control the EQ of the drum. So if your drum tends towards feeding back, we can adjust it there. Before we get going, if you're new to Max, you can open Options, Audio Status, and then select whatever your interface is, and select the appropriate ins and outs. So on my interface, I have the contact microphone plugged into input number 2, so I've selected input 2 here. And I have the transducer amplifier plugged into output 3 and 4, so I've selected output 3 and 4 here. Remember to turn the audio on, click the audio on button, enable the pedal, and you should be good to go. So within the patch, one of the biggest troubleshooting issues is dealing with feedback. So because the patch sends a lot of sound through the drum, there's a tendency for that sound to mix with the delay that Nina writes for on the rim and on the head of the drum to create a lot of feedback. So we have a couple things we can do to manage the feedback. On the one hand, we can adjust the microphone gain, which we can do here, or we can do in your interface or in a mixer. Turning this down is probably the #1 way to adjust and ameliorate the feedback. Likewise, we can adjust the tuning of the drum, and I found this to be quite effective. So in the piece, the drum is tuned pretty flabbily, and if you find that you're having feedback in a particular band of frequencies, I recommend detuning 1 or 2 of the tension rods to sort of fix that around. In addition, you can move the contact microphone. The contact microphone I like to place around like 2 p.m. on the drum because it's sort of out of my way. But you can move the contact microphone up and down the drum and left and right on the drum. Or if you're not using a contact microphone, you can move that around as well. Finally, you can adjust the EQ within the patch. So Nina gives us access to a couple different EQ filters. So here in the patch, you can see that I've found that there's a particular frequency range that tends to feed back on my instrument. So I've selected this frequency range and sort of reduced it. When you're testing the electronics, I recommend testing 3 places in the piece. First, cue number 1. This is where the electronics first turn on. So if you can sort of meaningfully play the drum here without feedback, you're in good shape. I recommend testing cue number 6. So in this cue, we should be able to hear some delay without feedback. It's kind of on the edge of feedback, so I'm going to adjust the snare, the microphone level. It's very close, so I can adjust this microphone level, and I can also sort of broadly turn this down. Better. Finally, I recommend checking cue number 21. This is the chorale in the piece. So if you're able to hear this sound, then you're in good shape. If you're getting a buzzing or rattling sound, I would check the connectors of the transducer, both on the amplifier and under the drum, or make sure it's just not touching something or the cables aren't touching something. Finally, in order to troubleshoot not getting enough delay, I recommend a couple things. We can mess with the microphone level and snare reinforcement within the patch. We want those to be as high as possible so that we hear the boop, boop, boop delay sound, which is a critical component of the piece. One thing you can do is to turn down the main output and turn up the microphone levels as much as you can to reduce feedback, which kind of increases the blend there. Now let's dig into some of the special moments in this piece, Heart.throb. And we're gonna first investigate how we engage with the electronics and then think a little bit about how we can bring that to life in a powerful way. Let's start at the beginning, basically from the first page of the piece. What's happening here? Well, Nina's gradually unveiling the electronic sounds. And as we'll see, the electronics tell a story on their own without us. And we as the performer are sort of filtering those sounds by doing basically 2 things: pressing into the drum head and then also rolling around the drum head. And by extension of rolls, also some notes. And we're sort of exploring gradually the introduction of this sound world. So in order to investigate what we need to be able to do, let's listen to the electronics and see how we fit into that story. So I'm going to start at number 2. So we hear sort of an undulating sound, right? Here's number 3. New sound. Here's number 4. Number 5. So if you're listening through and you can't hear that, I recommend adjusting your drum a little bit. So what can we do as performers in order to help bring that to life? So in this first page, Nina calls upon us to sort of press into the drum head to sort of filter and create kind of melodic ideas with those. So it stands to reason that our pressure needs to have a lot of variance, from light, as she notes, to really, really heavy, from the edge to the center of the drum. Likewise with our rolls, Nina notes, for example, at measure 8 and 9, to move our placement around the drum head. That's in order to sort of filter the sounds of the drum. So let's try to put that into practice. I'm just going to start at number 4, just for fun. So here we're going from the edge to the center, right? We want to explore, as we're practicing, as much contrast as we can. In fact, I generally play this first page holding one part of the drum so that I can more successfully squeeze the drum head. The final thing I'll say about this page is that number 6, this improvisation. Here we are. Here our goal is to explore the delay. And then we're going. Now let's talk about the second page of Heart.throb. Basically the music beginning at measure 24 or cue number 8 and ending at cue number 19 or measure number 41. I would call this the first adventure of the piece. It's the first time we really get to take a spin as a performer and we really get to engage with the electronics in sort of an explosive way. So step 1 for me, as I mentioned earlier, would be to listen through to these electronics. In this section, the sinusoids build on one another, gradually becoming more and more intense. And surprise, so does our playing. When you get a sense of how the electronics sound, then we can think about how we want our own playing to sound. So let's start first, again, by listening to the electronics and sort of maybe singing our part or thinking about our part on top of it. So here's cue number 8. All right, getting into it. So we're going. Here's number 9. Getting more, so we're playing over it. Here's number 10. Uh-oh, more intense. Here's number 11. Here's 12. Here's 13. 14. 15. 16. 17. 18. 19. So what I hear here is the electronics gradually adding on and adding on. And over top of that, we're going to be adding our own delay and our own filtering to it. So by playing on the rim of the drum, we can filter it. I would characterize the playing that we need to be able to do as, on the one hand, really specific. We need to be really clear about going back and forth on the shaft of our stick, and really clear about our dynamics, because these dynamics really engage with the electronics. On the other hand, we need to develop kind of a broad growth over the page. The music becomes fragmented and the accents gradually get closer and closer to one another. So we can add on to and help that gradual written crescendo almost as we're practicing. But first, I would recommend breaking this down. So I would practice first just the rhythms of the piece, maybe not even on the rim, just on the drum, just to get a sense of kind of rhythmic stability. So something like. So here, just like earlier, I've removed layers of difficulty. We're not playing on the rim. We're not moving on the rim. We're not playing rim shots. And we're also not playing the center of the drum stuff. And we're also not stepping on the pedal. But once you feel you've mastered this, then we can explore the stuff on the rim of the drum. So here, it's really important that we're specific about playing close to our fingers, because that glissando is really meaningful to the piece. And so here I recommend spending some time maybe just going back and forth from what Nina notes as number 1 or 2 to something that Nina notes as maybe 7. So we can get some meaningful contrast. If you can do that part alone, then slowly integrate it with the accents that she writes. So here's number 24. Something like that. I recommend doing it slowly. Even with the electronics, you are in control of when the electronics move on. So we can do it quite slowly. So with that in mind, let's try number 8 slowly, but with the electronics. One thing you might notice here, and one tip I would give to someone approaching this piece, is that your sound and the delay of your sound and the sinusoids become really well blended. That's the point. But it almost means that we need to be more sure of ourselves as a performer in terms of the execution of our part, so that we don't sort of adjust to what's going on and kind of mess up with a delay. So in conclusion for this section, I recommend as a first step, listening to the electronics, singing your part, and going through the cues, developing specificity for your motions, doing them slowly, one at a time, chunking them, and then putting them back together into the piece. All right, now let's talk about the chorale in Heart.throb. This is the section beginning around measure 50 and going until cue number 23 in the music. This is one of my favorite moments of the piece because it really highlights the unique relationship between the performer and the drum in this piece. In this section, the performer, by pressing into the head with various parts of the hands, creates a really interesting melody. So I recommend, just like with the other sections, that we listen to the electronics. We get a handle on the undulation of the electronics, and then we see how we can manipulate that, first with maximum contrast, and then within the parameters of the piece. So I'm going to turn it to number 21 now. So at first we just listen to the sounds. Now let's try pressing into the head, just to experiment with how much melody we can create. Pressing a lot. Ooh. So maybe that's our maximum. Now let's experiment with the different parts of the hand that Nina talks about. So we have the base of our palm, we have the middle of our hand, and then we have our fingertips. maybe create a little etude for yourself where you explore that a little bit. In this section of the piece, I recommend using the durations that Nina writes pretty exactly. So for example, from measure 50, it would be 1 and 2 and 3 and 1, 3. Triplet. As a sidebar here, as a performer, we need to be somehow interested in the visual aspect of this as well. As we talked about in Tonia's piece, Negative Magic, we need to sort of match our actions to the sound. So here, if you have the ability to sort of draw focus to yourself pressing into the head, I think that can be really helpful. Now let's introduce the other player in the conversation, the Dreadlock. This sound should be with this delay. Let's try it. Like that. Slowly could work, but maybe a little faster. Let's try it in context. So 1 and 2 and. Other way. Good. We have 2 more dreadlock techniques. One is the scrape onto the head, as seen at measure 59, which looks like this. I like to do it as a dead stroke. And the other one is the letting the dreadlock stay on the drum head, which you see at measure 64. Let's get into it. And into escape. Like that. So one more time. Finally, when we get to number 22, we are going to be pressing in and out of the head and then turn the snares on. And it's kind of a really dramatic moment in the piece. Yeah, exciting. All right, now let's talk about one of my favorite moments in Heart.throb, from cue number 24, or measure number 76, until cue number 33, or measure number 110. There's a lot to unpack here. So this is a great example of a section on which we can use the technique of chunking, breaking down a complicated task into its individual parts. So here we need to be able to play on the rim of the drum. We need to be able to control moving up and down the shaft of our stick on the rim of the drum. And we need to be able to control the difference between doubles and triples. So the difference between and triples. At the same time, eventually we need to be able to cross our hands over. That's a lot. Let's take them one by one. But throughout, let's keep in our head the idea of what's happening here musically. So from 24 to 31, the cues, the electronics sort of form like a lower tapestry that gradually becomes more urgent. And just like the second page of the piece, it's important that we can execute our filtering with real panache and real specificity so that when we get into working with the electronics, that duo comes across really strongly. So let's break it down. This is an example of a place where I would, instead of playing on the rim, I would play on the drum just to practice, because the rim is generally less forgiving in terms of rebound. I would use a mute. Here I have a towel. This is helpful for really getting a handle on the difference between the doubles and the triples. So throughout this page, the page 4, we see a lot of different doubles and triple strokes. So I recommend first just developing the ability to go between them. Maybe we do some double strokes. Cool, now let's try some triple strokes. Midterm, let's try to combine them. Yeah, so in the piece, this might occur at a place like 82, where we have as you're learning this, even if you feel pretty comfortable with the technique, I recommend going hellaciously slow, just to make sure we get these densities exactly locked in the way we want them. So maybe something like something like that, I think is going to be really helpful. Then we can put it onto the rim of the drum. So this is measure 83. Something like that. Then we can get a little bit of nuance with it. Then we can experiment with that. One thing to note here is that playing on the rim of the drum tends to magnify the unevenness of your hands. So as you're practicing either on the head of the drum or on a practice pad, God forbid, whatever, it's helpful to be able to work on the evenness of the color of your hands, because that's something that's really important in the piece. Great. Let's tackle another technical challenge, which is the section beginning at measure 92. In this section, Nina writes for us to cross over. So our right hand is going to go, and then maybe later our left hand does the same thing. As kind of a heuristic for this, instead of looking directly at the numbers that she describes in terms of the position on the shaft, I like to think close to my hand, closer to the tip, closer to the tip. So it kind of goes along with this gradual lifting of the stick. We put that together with the left hand. So to practice this, I first recommend just taking out the crossing over. So this is measure 92. You might just practice on the rim of the drum. Again. Something like that. Then you might try to add in the crossings. Same with the left hand. Doing this slowly and breaking it down into component parts is the #1 way to develop flexibility when you play the piece. And I can tell you from experience that the experience of integrating yourself with the electronics can be jarring at first. It can be really confusing, and it can cause you to sort of mess up your performance of the piece. And since we want to meaningfully engage with our ears, we need to develop complete physical and aural mastery of these skills. So I recommend hovering a long time on the execution of these difficult sections and really trying to develop a nuanced sense of how you're going to do it. That means starting slow, getting faster, maybe going too fast, isolating the doubles and the triples, putting them into an exercise, getting rid of the crossovers, and then maybe putting them back in, really focusing on the accents, and then practicing the page by doing the pedals, even if you're just stomping your foot on the ground. And then, and only then, do I think we can integrate the electronics, because while we want to be listening to the electronics as we work on this section, here's an example of something where we need utter specificity from our hands. Throughout, just one final note is that one of the main issues of this piece that comes out in the performance is the logistics of working with the cues. So I would say from day one of practicing, if you're learning this piece, be working on stepping your foot or pressing a pedal every time there's one of these cues, because it has a tendency to snap us out of our focus when we're on the stage and make us worry about where's the pedal, where's everything. And if you integrate it from day one, it becomes intuitive, it becomes a durable piece of knowledge for yourself. What I love about learning this piece, Heart.throb, is that I get to play chamber music. I get to play chamber music with a really interesting, nuanced, and exciting chamber music partner. So over the course of learning this piece, I feel I learned a lot about how to make sound on my instrument and how to fulfill a totally different role than I'm used to doing when I play the snare drum. So how did we get there? Well, we started by thinking about style in general. Like, what are the characteristics of Nina's music? The thing that jump out to you. They might be different things than jump out to me. So I encourage you to draw your own conclusions from her repertoire. Then we looked for the moments in the piece that had something special to say. And then we extrapolated from those moments an approach to the piece that takes us through all of the text to the piece, but adds to it an idea of how we can weave those moments together into a compelling, theatrical, dramatic, almost ritualistic piece. In this piece, with regard to the other pieces in Unsnared drum, I would encourage you to be extremely exact with regard to the text and specifically the parameters around the filtering that you have to do as a performer. Nina's very specific, and that specificity doesn't necessarily come across to an audience in terms of performative virtuosity, but it's a huge part of meaningfully engaging with the electronics. So your job is to do these actions really specifically, really accurately, but do them in a way that creates a really interesting and compelling narrative. That's why when we were talking about this piece, I recommend doing a lot of work without the electronics, paradoxically, really breaking things down, making them intuitive, because finally, as you're working on this piece, you're probably gonna spend a lot of time troubleshooting the electronics. So you need to have complete physical mastery of the drum in order to give yourself the headspace to be messing with the electronics at 7:59 for an 8 p.m. concert. The final takeaway I would have in talking about Heart.throb is that this piece is ridiculously flexible in terms of types of interpretations. Although Nina's very specific in the score about what to do, the sound emerging from the piece is really dependent on the drum, the performer, the implements, how the drum is tuned, how the electronics sort of pass through the instrument, what the materials of the drum are, where you're playing the piece, who you're playing it for, the acoustic of that space. And it's kind of a great adventure to be able to do something so specific and have it be so individualistic at the same time. So I look forward to hearing you play the piece too.